Morning, everyone. Looks like we're reaching critical mass here. We'll give everybody just another minute to get logged in.
Might just ask the question real quick, who the unknown attendee is on the list. We can get that name changed so it's clear.
Unknown guest, can you unmute yourself and identify yourself, please?
It's possible they don't know that they're unknown.
Hey, Jeremy, that must be me.
Hi, Shane. Ashley, Shane Stack. There you go. Thank you.
Yep, got it.
Okay, looks like we're ready here. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Morning, everybody. This is the February 4th meeting of the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee. My name is Jeremy Keene. I'm the chair of the committee. We are continuing to meet virtually. If you're logging in by computer, you can raise your hand to make comment and we'll admit you to the meeting. If you're calling in by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute. Ashley, would you call roll for me?
Yes, I will. Stack.
I'm here.
Cofield.
Present.
Allridge.
Here.
Brownlow. Buchanan.
Here.
Pehan.
Here.
Smith. Krauser.
Here.
Davis.
Here.
Gockler.
This is Neil Miner and proxy for Donna Gockler.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hammond.
I'm here.
Hellegard.
Here.
Keene.
I'm here.
Weiss.
Here.
Brander. Elstad.
Here.
Jackson.
Here.
Rock. And Potts.
This is Vicky Cernich, and I'm the proxy for Katie Potts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ashley.
You're welcome.
Our next item is to approve the minutes from our January 7th meeting. Any comments or changes to the minutes? Seeing none, without objection, those will stand approved. Item number 3 is public involvement or public comment. Any public comment on items that are not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to new business. We have 2 items of new business this month. First item is presentation and review on the final draft Highway 200 corridor plan and adoption process. Aaron Wilson and Kate Dinsmore.
Yeah, and Kate wasn't able to make it this morning. She had a conflict, but we do have Stephen McDaniel from WGM who can answer if any questions come up on the designs or cost estimates or those specifics. Stephen's here to help us answer those questions, but I'll walk us through a quick presentation. Let me get this up and running. All right, can everyone see my screen? Good. All right.
Yep.
So we are essentially at the final stage of this Highway 200 corridor plan, where we now have the draft plan ready. We've gone through review of the alternatives. We've made updates based on those comments that we received back in November and December. And so now my hope is that we can move into getting this plan adopted and then start thinking about how we implement it. So I'm going to go through just a quick overview of what's in the draft plan. There's a lot of detail there. We've presented most or all of that over the last year as we've gone through the process. So this is kind of just a review, remind us what we've done and where we're at, and then let everyone know where we're headed for adoption and get any last comments before we bring this back in March for the final plan adoption. So as a reminder, we do have the preferred alternative. There are 3 sections of this plan that we've been working on. It runs from Van Buren to essentially to Bonner or Tamarack, just before Bonner. The sections that we've reviewed and developed designs for are the East Broadway from Van Buren through to I-90 section, which we're calling the East Broadway. And then we have the core of East Missoula, which goes from I-90 through to Brickyard Hill or Staples Street. So we call that the East Missoula section. And then there's the rest from Brickyard Hill out to Tamarack, which is the, I think we called that the East Missoula to Bonner section. So three phases that are included in this. We looked at some different alternatives for each one of those sections, wanting to get this design to match the context, because it is a fairly diverse corridor as you move from the core of Missoula through East Missoula and then out towards Bonner. And we wanted the designs to be reflective of that and not come up with a single set of designs and standards that apply to the whole corridor. So there's a lot of improvements in here to take a look at. I'll give kind of a highlight of each of those highlights from each of those sections. And then we can talk about how we were proposing to break this up into project elements and what those costs are. So we'll start with the East Broadway section. This is an area that already has some existing facilities, including sidewalk and bike lanes. But we really looked at what would be the optimal transportation facilities through here. So those, and there haven't really been any changes to this section since the last time we presented, other than we've added some additional detail on the typical sections to reflect the variable right-of-way width. So one of the challenges through here is that the right-of-way can vary, I believe, between 60 and 80 or 100 feet. And so we have typical sections that reflect those different right-of-way widths. So as you move through the corridor. Other than that, this section has the shared use path as the primary transportation corridor or transportation facility for bicycles and pedestrians. We had a lot of discussion at the last DTAC about the inclusion of bike lanes in addition to that shared use path, and that's really to accommodate those primary bike commuters who are coming from East Missoula and may want to just stay on bike lanes, and it essentially matches the existing roadway. The other piece through here that we talk a little bit about in the plan is the potential to have a riverfront shared use path. And if that becomes a feasible option, then I think we can come back and look at, is this shared use path, do we have one along the river and one along the road? Do we prioritize one over the other? But ultimately, we want to have that protected facility on the south side of the road where the majority of the development is occurring. The other piece of this is we're looking at the bus stop locations and getting some lighting at locations where we really need it on the corridor, particularly at those bus stops and at potential conflict points like the railroad underbridge and in the core sort of along from Van Buren through that developed portion of East Broadway. So the other part of this section is we wanted to highlight is as it approaches Van Buren, some of the intersection improvements and really thinking about circulation with these commercial areas. And as this redevelops, there's some opportunity to create some additional access control in here for safety, improve some of the efficiency of travel flow through here. And Stephen can answer any questions, I think, about this design if there's anything specific, but really trying to think about the access to these properties, how people are doing that, and making sure that we're increasing safety and preventing some of the conflicts that might happen today. Obviously, with this particular portion of the project, we'll want to integrate that with any designs that come out of work at the Van Buren Broadway intersection. We'll want to tie in facilities and think about that full intersection traffic flow. But this is sort of the concept for how we could sort of improve this section of the corridor. Then at the east end of the East Broadway section, we have the railroad bridge. And as we talked about, this is really, we're looking at what we heard from just about everybody is that the preferred option is to replace that railroad bridge with something that allows more multimodal facilities through there. So widening it to allow bike facilities, vehicle traffic, pedestrian access, continuing that shared use path through under the bridge. And so that's a really significant part of this corridor plan in terms of the cost and the challenges of getting that done. So that moves us into the East Missoula segment. This is a much more urban typical section in the design. We haven't made a lot of changes to this design. The concept is still basically the same in terms of having protected cycle tracks and sidewalks. So having a transition from the shared use path to protected bike lanes as you come into East Missoula, creating a more urban street that has that center turn lane, travel lanes, and where there's a right of way and need adding in potentially on-street parking for some of those businesses that may lose their parking access as we develop this corridor. Some of the businesses are close enough that their parking bleeds into the right of way. And so we want to make sure that they don't lose that and that we have adequate parking along this section of the highway. Proposing lighting throughout East Missoula. That's something we've heard over and over from the East Missoula residents that lighting is a real challenge in here and creates a real safety problem. Also proposing to relocate transit stops from Speedway onto Highway 200. And so having good crossing improvements located at those transit stops and to help increase the permeability across Highway 200 for pedestrians. There is increasing development on that northwest side of the highway and wanting to make sure people can get, as the corridor redevelops, that there's good pedestrian permeability of this corridor. So this is a rendering of what that would look like, or conceptual rendering of what that would look like with the protected bike lane, sidewalk, boulevard through the core of East Missoula. The other part of this plan is thinking about access management. Currently, there's a lot. It's basically a free-for-all through a lot of East Missoula. There's no curb and gutter, no defined entry into parking lots or streets, and so a big goal of this project is to better define that, create predictability of where vehicles are entering and exiting the highway, and defining those parking lots. And then something that we've worked on a little bit since the last presentation is thinking about how those side streets intersect with Highway 200. Currently, they are skewed intersections, which we've heard from both residents and from a safety perspective that creates issues. And so this plan looked at a couple of different options. One is creating, just squaring off those intersections as they hit Highway 200, which because of the angle that they're hitting creates offset T intersection geometry, which we don't think creates some other additional turning movement conflicts and safety issues. And so that may not be the preferred way to do it. A better approach that we think is the right way to square those intersections off is to essentially, because of the limited right of way, we're limited on how much we can shift the roadways, but with a little bit of shifting each roadway to the east or west and then squaring it off, we can get those lined up. It's not exactly a perfect 90-degree intersection, but it's much closer and creates the turn radius and curb lines that will help facilitate and slow traffic as they're making those turns and make them much more safe. And it's something, again, that we've heard from the residents of East Missoula, that they really want to see these intersections squared up as much as possible. And so this plan is recommending kind of this combined intersection geometry. And again, Stephen did a lot of work on this, so if there are questions specific to that recommendation, happy to have him answer those. So then the last section is Sharon, or from Sharon and Marshall out to Cmak, and this was the section that is primarily shared use path. As we've talked about in the past, we relocated that or are proposing to have that located on the north side of the highway through this section for a couple of reasons. One, that's where all of the houses and residential are, so it makes it easier for people to access the trail as they're, for the folks who live along this section. It also addresses some of the issues we have or constraints with where the river is and getting the trail through. There's real constraints at the Marshall Canyon, and we think the north side of the highway offers us some more flexibility in terms of actually fitting the trail, a full 10-width shared use path through that pinch point. This section also includes a parking lot, adding a parking lot for Sharon and connection to the existing fishing access, and then a more improved bus stop at Speedway or at the Sharon access to try to facilitate transit usage in the summer in particular, and get the cars off the highway during that summer tuber hatch. Interestingly, the parking lot may be the piece of this project that is moving forward faster than other pieces. There's been a lot of progress made with MDT and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in the county on potential access for a parking lot in that area just down the highway from Sharon. So that's kind of exciting that may actually happen sooner rather than later, or there seems to be a lot of potential for that. And then, yeah, ending out at Cmak, having a trail connection that crosses back over the highway, paired with a bus stop. Again, throughout this corridor, we tried to pair bus stops and trail crossings of the highway. So focusing all of that user activity of bicycle, pedestrian, and transit riders into combined locations to try to minimize conflicts and to increase visibility, and do things like putting in RFBs and well-marked crossings so that those become highly visible pedestrian crossings and reducing conflicts in other parts of the corridor. So that's the quick overview of the plan. There's a lot more detail in the draft document and in all of the work that went into developing that preferred alternative. But the other piece that we've added to this in this draft are thinking about the funding and implementation. That this plan really gets us to a conceptual design for the corridor, but there are a lot more steps that we're going to have to take to actually get this project constructed, including finding the funding. I'll go through the different project elements and what they cost, but it's a substantial project to do this whole corridor from Van Buren to Cmak. We need to do the engineering and survey and get this project really shovel ready so that when that funding is available, we're ready to go to construction. So we do have some implementation recommendations and some additional information related to how we think that could proceed, including breaking this into discrete project elements, knowing that we may not be able to get all of the funding for the whole corridor in one go. And so we can be creative in looking for funding for different segments and construct it over time. So we have this table in the plan that breaks down each of those project elements, has planning level costs associated with it, what's included in that segment. So if there are any feasibility constraints or issues, and then goals for what that section is going to provide in terms of improvements to the transportation system. And then we tried to give some priority to how each of those segments rank. If we had to prioritize different parts of this corridor, how we tried to provide some guidance on how we might do that. Obviously, there could be opportunistic or grant criteria that lead us to one over the other, but this gives us a sense of which segments we should focus on for implementation. And then we have some potential funding sources that we could use for either some or all of each one of these project sections. So for example, the first one, the East Missoula, that core of East Missoula streetscape and reconstruction of the roadway, that's a high priority. We think it's about $7 million. And funding sources that we could use for that might be HSIP to address some of the safety issues that we know exist along that corridor, build grant, potentially Main Street funding through the state might be a creative way to get some work done on that corridor. Cmak obviously could be used for multimodal improvements like this. So looking at a number of different funding options and trying to think about how we prioritize this segment. So I don't necessarily want to go through each one of these in detail, but again, the table in the plan really breaks it down by discrete elements and tries to give some priority to those. I think that's all I want to say about that. So then the next steps for this, we have a public comment period open for the next 3 weeks. So basically through the end of February, we have it on our website. We've been sending out notices to East Missoula and folks who have been participating in this process just to get any last feedback on what we have in the draft plan. This is sort of the time to give us those last edits. Hopefully there are a few comments because we spent a lot of time refining this preferred recommendation and getting the draft plan going. So we received a lot of comments already. Then my hope is that we can bring this back after that public comment period for MPO adoption in March, and then bring this to the city and the county for adoption in April or May or sometime after the MPO adoption. So that's where we're headed. That's generally what's in the plan. If anyone has questions or comments or thoughts, we can go talk about specific design elements if there are still questions, or the project elements or the funding and implementation. And like I said, Stephen's here, so now's a great time to ask about any specific design questions that you might have.
Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah.
If you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm not seeing any yet. I have one. Could you go back to the slide that showed the skewed intersections?
Yes. And
so my question is, does the plan provide any guidance on when you would look at realigning an intersection versus keeping the existing geometry? I think in a lot of engineering standards, you have kind of a threshold for when that skew is severe enough that you'd want to try to address it.
Yeah, so I'll take that, Aaron. Most of these are kind of outside of that threshold, Jeremy. They're right on the verge of that 30% or 30 degrees. I apologize. So 30 degrees measured off of perpendicular. So if it's within that range, then we would say that maybe you could keep it in there. In addition to that standard, this was brought up by the public as being a desire to fix. So we went ahead and recommended that when the reconstruction of East Missoula happens, that we address these intersection issues.
And I think that, because of that limited right-of-way, right, Stephen, that there's we're really constrained on how much we can, unless there's an adjacent property owner who is interested in dedicating some right-of-way, or, we can obtain it through development or some other process that we're really constrained. So doing as much realigning as possible as we construct those intersections. So it may not be pulling it into a full 90-degree intersection, but we can straighten them out as much as possible when we do that curb work, and putting in the sidewalk. And I think even just having the curb and sidewalk and other facilities out there is going to be a huge improvement to what's there today, even if you can't do substantial realignment.
Yeah, I think that it's an important detail because there's kind of a point of diminishing returns to the benefit you get. And like you said, it gets much more challenging with right-of-way and costs. So
Yeah, and in addition to that, we did look at the crash trends out there, and they do lead to the fact that some of the crashes that are happening along East Missoula could be attributed to these angles. You know, the sharp angle when you're turning right requires you to slow down more than anticipated, and there is a rear end crash history out there. And then when you're pulling out, you have to kind of look back left over your shoulder, and there is that crash history of kind of that right angle crash at some of these intersections. So I do think it's warranted that we look at these intersection geometries as we rebuild the corridor.
thanks. Any other questions from the committee?
If there are no other comments or questions, yeah, we'll bring this back in March with a recommended motion to adopt the plan, and should be hopefully a fairly straightforward. We can give a summary of public comments that we received, if any, and hopefully that is an easy one to adopt in March.
Yeah, looks like a lot of good work. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, folks, WGM, for their work on this. I guess, leading into your next topic, do some of these projects that are recommended in the plan then find their way into the transportation plan?
Yeah, yes. So we have this, that is a good lead in, but this is a corridor we looked at in the long range plan, and I think will end up being a high priority, or at least a really critical connection. And so we'll have this plan to reference, this corridor plan to reference in the long range plan. So it's not a general project. We're not left with just a general project description. We actually have this corridor plan, and we have cost estimates that we can reflect. And so this really helps us dial in the recommendations in the long range plan.
Great. Okay, well, let's move on to the next item, which is presentation on the draft long-range transportation plan, recommended scenario, funding outlook, and initial programmatic recommendations. Aaron Wilson and Jennifer Weiland.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll let Jennifer kick this off, but we're starting to enter the kind of home stretch of the long-range plan, and so we've got some starting to pull things together and forming what we think is going to be in the recommended plan. And so we have some of that to present and some questions to ask all of you, and hopefully get some feedback as we go into this sort of final round of drafting our recommendations and the plan and getting final public input. So Jennifer, do you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Just pull up the slides. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all again. And Jeremy, thanks for the seamless transition between one presentation and the next, because indeed, the project that you all just heard about is part of the recommended scenario. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what else is included as we go through a few slides today. Aaron and I have put together a handful of slides to just kind of catch everybody up to what we've been up to over the last couple of months, but this really is going to be an opportunity, we hope, to hear from TTAC about a few of the key decisions and trade-offs that we've made. We don't have to solve everything today, but over the course of the next few weeks, we do want to be continuing to refine this recommended scenario and getting pretty close to what we think will be included in the draft plan. So as we get started today, we are going to share with you, and this is included in your packets, the draft recommended scenario. We'll talk a little bit about how we shaped that. As we go into some discussion about that, again, we're going to try and highlight for you some areas where we do think there are still key decisions to be made about what is and isn't included. And then Erin's been working with many of you to develop updated revenue projections, and we'd like your thoughts on those, and especially some of the assumptions that we've used around discretionary funding. So those are our two major topics today. We also will talk just very briefly about some of the non-infrastructure pieces of the plan and then what happens next. So just as a reminder for folks, this is sort of the big picture process that we have been going through with you over the last 6+ months. As we gathered projects and programs, we screened them and used our evaluation framework to score them. And then through October and November, and then through conversation with the public in December and early January, we developed and ranked the scenarios and got some really good input about what is most important to include in the recommended scenario. So now we are at the point of having that initial list of recommended projects. As we move forward over the next few weeks, we'll be working to prioritize those further and make sure that we have all of the right things included within the fiscal constraint that we have set. So we are moving toward that very last piece of this process. So the 3 transportation scenarios, just as a quick reminder of where we were when we saw you last in December, we shaped 3 scenarios that are multimodal in nature, that all meet a fiscal constraint of roughly $180 million, but then also tried to illustrate the ways that different combinations of projects and different combinations of investments could move us toward our goals in slightly different ways. So we had a new connection scenario, an enhanced connection scenario, and then regional equity. You will remember that we evaluated those 3 scenarios against more than 15 different metrics. We also looked at 2 different growth patterns, one that we called business as usual and one that was more of a strategic growth approach. And what we saw is that all 3 of the scenarios move us toward the goals that have been set through the plan, but they do it in really different ways. So we saw that new connections, for example, really had some benefits when we looked at freight movement, when we looked at some of the core connections between commercial areas and between neighborhoods. Enhanced connections was one of our more affordable scenarios and was really providing a lot of benefits around safety, around walking and biking connectivity. And then regional equity did a lot for connecting some of the key neighborhoods where we have historically underinvested areas, and then also a lot of support for affordability. Across all 3 of those scenarios, we saw that when we applied the strategic growth scenario, these transportation network scenarios were doing more. So that was information that we shared with the public over the course of our December outreach. And we heard a lot from people, and we heard preferences in terms of how people saw each of those scenarios working for them. So over the course of December and then into early January, we hosted online open houses. We attended standing board meetings and different community group meetings. And we engaged with people through our website, through social media, and through an online survey. We heard pretty consistently a preference for the enhanced connections and the regional equity scenario. And this is just a snapshot of some of the online survey results. You can see that enhanced connections and regional equity were the 2 most popular scenarios. But a lot of folks really were seeing projects that they liked in all 3 scenarios and hoping that we could mix and match to a certain extent. And I think that matches what we heard from many of you over the course of developing those scenarios. We also asked people about the types of projects that are most important to them, whether that is complete streets projects, intersection projects, different types of active transportation projects. And we did hear very, very strong support for complete streets and some of the key complete streets corridors that were identified in the scenarios, as well as a lot of support for neighborhood greenways. So we used that input as a portion of what we were considering as we shaped this recommended scenario. So I'm going to give you just a few highlights of some of the additional thinking that went into shaping this, and then we'll take a look at it together and talk a bit about what is and isn't included. So in part because of the feedback that we received, which really had a lot of preference for enhanced connections and regional equity scenarios, we started by including all of the projects that were in both of those scenarios. And you may remember there was a decent amount of overlap between those two in the first place. So all of those projects were initially included in the recommended scenario. Then we went back through all of the feedback we've received from our committees, from the public. We really looked at the preferences around project types, and then also looked for specific projects that have been identified as critically important through this process. Those then were included in the recommended scenario. The next thing that we did was go back to our scoring. So as over the course of the fall, as we were using the evaluation framework to score the projects, we applied an equity weighting to that scoring in order to really elevate projects that were going to do the most to enhance equity based on the criteria set out in the plan. So we used some of those highest scoring projects from the new connections scenario, and also projects that were in either the enhanced connections or regional equity scenarios. So this was a way to really do some of that mixing and matching that folks were interested in, but to make sure that we were continuing to bring forward some of the projects that scored the best. From there, you won't be surprised to hear that we were over the fiscal constraint, which is around $180 million for non-committed projects. So with that, we worked closely with the MPO team to move some projects between the recommended scenario and the illustrative list. We tried to identify if there were parallel routes. So if there were two projects that were essentially doing the same thing, was there one that we could include versus the other? We looked at the relative priority based on what we've heard from all of you, based on what we heard from the community, and then did rely on those scores again to make some of the decisions. So in our recommended scenario right now, you do have this list included. You have, I think, a link to an interactive map, and then also this version of the static map. As we took all of those steps that I just outlined, we really tried to focus on hitting some of what came up over and over. And this was true for the initial scenarios as well. We really did try and focus on closing gaps, so gaps between neighborhoods, gaps in projects, and linking and completing some of the investments that have already been made in the region or that are moving forward through committed funding. So the recommended scenario includes a lot of what we have heard are important complete streets connections. You can see a few of them listed on the screen, including East Broadway and Highway 200. A couple of others that I didn't call out in the bullet, but that have really come up throughout this process include the California Street complete street, Rattlesnake Drive as a complete street, Brooks Street, and then the Front and Main two-way conversion. There are a lot of neighborhood greenways included in this recommended scenario, including Grant Street, Sherwood, Benton, Gerald, Schilling, and a lot more. But of course, everything doesn't fit. And so there are important connections that aren't included here. The Miller Creek Shared Use Path is an example. The Higgins Pedestrian Bridge is another. The Riverfront Triangle non-motorized bridge is one that we've talked about before and that is not currently included in the recommended scenario. And then the project that was the most expensive from our initial scenarios, which is the Russell Street to I-90 extension. And as we go through our conversation today, we'll talk a little bit about some of those trade-offs that we made in terms of deciding not to include those initially. I do want to note that all projects that were previously in a scenario but are not in the recommended scenario are now part of our illustrative projects list. Additionally, projects that were on the illustrative list are still there. So the interactive map is the place that you can go to turn on and off the recommended scenario and then be able to look closely at the illustrative projects as well. I highlighted a few of these that aren't included, just as I was talking about what is in the recommended scenario. But I think one thing that Erin and I really want to stress and want to hear from you today is that there still can be movement between what are the illustrative projects and the projects in the recommended scenario. In fact, we expect that. There are really good projects that are illustrative right now, projects that scored well. And so those are probably what we would consider the top tier eligible to move. So as we move through our conversation with you, as we talk with our Citizens Advisory Committee and our Technical Advisory Committee over the next couple of weeks, that's really what we want to be dialing in. Whether there are projects that need to shift and what that looks like to do it. The other piece of this will be, as we continue to look at the revenue forecasts, do we actually have additional funding that we aren't including right now? And what flexibility does that give us to be able to advance a few more projects? So,
Jennifer, I was just gonna say one other thing about illustrative projects that I think we might want, that I would appreciate consideration for, is if there are illustrative projects that really just don't make sense to have in the plan. You know, some of these have been around for quite some time. I don't think we want projects in the plan that we would never consider advancing as a project. So that might be something, you know, I don't think we should ignore the illustrative project list. It's worth taking a look at that and making sure that we have the right projects, or that we're removing the ones that are not, just we would never consider moving forward.
Great, thank you for that, Aaron. We did do a feasibility screen early on of projects that are included on the illustrative list and tried to get rid of things that don't make sense, but I'm sure there are more. So that would be a great ask of this group as well. And so let's talk about a few of the areas where we did make trade-offs. Aaron, I'll turn it over to you for this piece.
Yeah, and before I jump into this, Neil and Ellen, and I think Ben had, do we want to take a moment to answer questions about where we're at right now? Maybe Neil, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer and Aaron. This looks great. I think the concerns I have on the illustrative are removing projects, or there's a lot of projects that are opportunistic depending on development in the area. And having them in the long-range transportation plan, whether it's an illustrative project or a preferred project, regardless of whether we would do it in the future as a project, a standalone in our high priority list, it's still beneficial to have them on that plan.
Yep.
And so I would be hesitant to remove anything or request removing anything, but it's always nice to have some backup.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would only recommend moving something that we would never consider. You know, if there are just legacy projects that have been in here that are just so far out afield, I think we've gotten most of those out that we know have feasibility or other constraints that we're just never going to be able to do it. But if there are any left, or that just, if they've changed for some reason, let us know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Neil, that's such a good point too about the illustrative list. Like, it's not just the storing place for projects that didn't make the cut for recommended projects. It does give us that flexibility to be opportunistic and to be able to seize funds that we didn't know were available, or look at public-private partnerships. So that's a good point in terms of how we describe what that is.
And Ellen?
Yeah, sure. I was basically going to say the same thing Neil just pointed out, and I'll give you an absolutely wonderful example of that is the Mary Avenue connection between Brooks and Reserve. Our mantra for 2 years almost in this office became, this has been a project that the city has desired, and it has been memorialized in the long-range transportation plans going back as far as 1995, and only because that's as far back as I researched it. And that was a huge factor in trying to offset a lot of the public concerns about, were we just spending $7 million to benefit them all? Mm-hmm. And so those projects become really, really important. And, you know, as Neil pointed out, when the opportunity presents itself, we got something to rely on besides we think this is a great idea. Mm-hmm. So let's be really thoughtful before we take things out.
Yeah.
Great.
I think the bridge over South Reserve Street also fits that same bill.
I think so. Yeah.
We took a little flack on that one too.
Yeah.
Some of you may remember.
Maybe continue to.
Nah, I don't pay any attention now.
Ben?
I was coming to say the same thing, and then I have some specific questions about even some of the recommended projects that I'm not able to make a ton of sense of, but maybe we can have those discussions at the next technical advisory committee meeting. I don't know that we need to take the time here, but I'll certainly review the list and make some comments.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, I think we would ask all of you, as you continue to look at the list, I think we'd hope for by maybe a week and a half or so from today, maybe before the 17th, if we could get any specific thoughts or questions on the recommended scenario or the illustrative scenario, that would be helpful for those next steps conversations. But please do reach out if you've got questions about what the heck a project is or the description doesn't make sense. We can provide some more detail on that.
So Aaron, I've got several hands up. Are you through your presentation? Are you ready for questions, or do you want to continue on?
We've got some more to present, but if there's any questions on where we're at right now.
Okay, I've got Ellen and Dave Gray. Do you have questions about where we're at in the presentation right now?
I already did mine.
Thank you.
Sorry.
My only thing with removing illustrative projects is those went through a public process and they've been received, and we can't necessarily just dismiss them. And I think Neil Miner had a good point. You know, some of those projects, even if they seem like they're like completely out of whack, there may be a funding source, you know, in the future. And as we're moving forward through Mullen area plan, and who knows what's going to happen with target range, you know, we should retain those projects so we don't have to do further long range plan amendments. And that's all I have to say about that.
Great. Thanks, Dave.
All right. So I think this is a good transition into some, we wanted to focus on some key areas where we've tried to make some decision or, you know, take feedback and look at the network, and knowing that we couldn't do all of the projects that we had in these areas, but they were topics that have come up in our conversations and our presentations, and as we were looking at scenarios, and just ask some targeted questions to all of you about these specific areas. So the first area, and some of these questions relate to projects that are not included in the recommended project list, and so we want to make sure that we have the right ones in. And the first area we wanted to focus on is kind of the North Reserve, Scott Street area. There's a lot of activity happening over there. You know, we just heard yesterday about the city's efforts around affordable housing and doing some really substantial development. There's the urban renewal district. There's just a lot happening in that area. And so we wanted to take a minute to look at what's in the recommended project list, and is this right? And should we make any adjustments? And the biggest change here, or, you know, one of the bigger pieces on this area is that we're not currently including the Russell Street to I-90 connection that includes the bridge over the railroad tracks and the I-90 interchange. Was one of the, if not the most expensive, one of the most expensive projects, and there just wasn't room to do that and all of the other things that we had in the enhanced connections and regional equity scenario. And so we took that out, but we did want to focus on connectivity in the area. And so we were looking at Howard Razor Drive, Complete Street as a really key connection through there, both from North Reserve to the north side. The I-90 trail connection connecting Grant Creek into the north side neighborhood. And then looking at some street connections, like connecting Turner or Scott Street up to Rogers, sort of through, I know they're sort of, that came up in one of our committee meetings, looking at, you know, maybe that is not the exact street connection, but looking at street connectivity in that area and what projects do we need to include in there. And so want to take a minute to look at that area. And then I guess sort of related to that or peripheral is sort of the Reserve Street, West Broadway, looking at we included the protected bike lane projects that connect the Mullen area plan, West Broadway, Reserve Street into the core of Missoula. So really focusing on some key protected bike lane facilities through that area, connecting Mullen or the Swatupkane area to the west side and downtown. So I think, our questions are that because there's so much activity going on, do these seem like the right projects? Are we missing something, or what might we want to do in this area? Ellen?
Yeah, one of the things that we're getting ready to embark on as part of the Scott Street redevelopment efforts, the developers of that almost 10-acre tract that the city bought last summer is going to engage a planning firm who will then engage engineering firms because there might be multiple disciplines involved. So I use plural. To really take a look at, number one, how that residential mixed use piece that the city will convey to the developers will potentially lay out, and what kind of infrastructure is internal to that, et cetera. But the other big piece that they're going to have to look at is mitigation of offsite impacts. It's not just from the development of that 9 acres, it's the 200 unit Bellagio, it's the 70 plus additional multifamily units that Dave Edgell is going to put at the west end of Scott Street Village. It's another piece of property that's on the market right now next to those apartments that are slammed up against the interstate right away. And then, as we all know, there's a ton of vacant land out there. Some of it the city controls and is currently being transitioned from basically material storage for public works to another use in the future. And we're talking about the potential to load a lot of traffic into an area that has one way in and out that's a collector, and that's Scott Street. We have potential impact on North Side neighborhood, which we'll hear a whole lot about during the public process, which will be initiated in the coming month or two. And I think that interstate interchange may well end up being a really important piece of discussion in this whole process that we're embarking on, that was catalyzed by the purchase of the Scott Street Partners property. But it's a snowball, and it's a snowball that has the potential to become a big snowball. And we have a pretty sophisticated neighborhood to the east that recognizes that snowball is out there. So I understand that the interchange is a really expensive piece of work, but we may have the wherewithal to take on a really expensive piece of work. So let's not diminish the possibility or the importance of having that as one of the things in our back pocket as we talk with already existing residents out there and people who are potential residents out there in our own internal departments about how we deal with that area. Because right now it's Scott Street or it's cut through traffic. That's it.
Right. That sort of two things out of that, Ellen, that might be important. One is, are we showing enough projects in the north side to mitigate sort of that increase in traffic that might be passing through? And it, maybe we don't. Maybe there are some additional projects or greenways or things that we should shift into looking at the north side. The other question is, should we, and I think this has come up in other conversations I've had, but maybe it makes sense to separate out the I-90 interchange from the Russell Street connection, that those shouldn't be one project. Those should probably be two, because you could do the interchange before you make the connection to Russell Street, I think.
Correct. And I think even the master plan for that area does not show that as a Russell Street connection to the interstate. It's a little more convoluted than that. And I think that, moving some of that traffic to the east is a potential. But I guess the frustration is the Mullen planning has been done, so it's easily able to be incorporated into this long-range transportation plan. Planning around North Reserve Scott Street on the east end of that urban renewal district is yet to be done. And we need the latitude of the room in this to incorporate that when it's cooked.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask the same question. I would like to know what the benefit of the interchange with I-90 would be for these other road connections, and how that would alleviate traffic, maybe going back through the neighborhood. The other one that we have a CIP item for that's ranked fairly high in our local funding is the Turner Warden North Fifth Collector Street improvements, which is really getting that up to a full complete street standard. And I think that's an important connection here that is maybe not shown that we should.
Yeah.
Sorry, one last point is that project 33, which is the extension of Turner, I think it's really important that we show that connecting to Howard Razor Drive, because that becomes that collector route that goes all the way to Reserve Street.
Yeah, the Turner Warden North Fifth should be, that might just be an oversight on our part getting that. That should be a committed project because it's in the city's CIP. So we tried to pull all the CIP projects forward as committed, and so we'll add that as a committed project.
I was going to say the same thing, that's missing, and I think that the Eaton project is also not on the list as another committed CIP project.
I think those are probably missing. So one of the, and maybe we'll get to this when we talk about the funding, but we weren't sure how to do the city's sidewalk program, which is sort of evolving as we go in terms of how we manage that and the road district and the funding that goes into that program. And so I think initially when we were putting this together, those were sidewalk projects, but Turner and Eaton are both collectors. And so I think it does make sense to show those on here as committed collector street improvements that are in the CIP.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Maybe different from other, residential neighborhood projects that would just fall under that city sidewalk construction program.
The other piece I wanted to say, I appreciate Ellen's vision and holistic approach to looking at the north side and the development potential up there. And I do agree that we should keep transportation options on the table, at least as illustrative. So a kind of a even macro scale version of what Neil brought up. It's not just little trail connections with individual developments. It's major, could be major regional connections that are snowballed into existence by these development projects. But I also want to say that it would be great if land use is a major part of how we are dealing with the increased development pressure there, and not trying to force a whole bunch of traffic onto Scott Street because we're actually building supermarkets and services and employment on the north side as well. And so that those people don't need to leave the neighborhood to meet their needs.
Dave Graves had his hand up. Dave?
And Ellen, I think all of your points are awesome, and the North Reserve Scott Street URD is pretty critical right now. And what we aren't talking about are on ramps and off ramps off I-90 onto Coal Mine Road, and that would be 164, I think, or somewhere close to that. That's another big consideration on the Russell Street to I-90 connection, is the connection. And that one's going to be a tough one. And it's honestly the only area that we can make a reasonable connection to I-90 at this point, because otherwise we've got elevation and truly geologic constraints on how we approach the interstate, and it's a tough one. So I know that there are things that may impact neighborhoods over there, but it's really the only place that we can do it. And I don't know how MDT even feels about getting that in a new interchange. That's it.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks to all of you for these really good comments. So we'll make sure that the CIP projects that were mentioned get included and shown as committed. I would say that as we look more closely at this area, there are a good number of projects that are on the illustrative list. I was just taking a peek at our interactive map and sort of gauging what else we've got there that we could add in. So I would encourage you, as you do dig into the project list a little bit more closely, take a particular look at the illustrative projects in that area to think about both, do we have the right things captured for illustrative, and is there anything that does need to be elevated to recommended? Great.
So I just real quickly, I would just point out that probably in 1995, there were people who said we will never get a connection through Southgate Mall. That being in the long range transportation plan served us really well 25 years later. Just saying. So
Well,
just because it seems daunting and just because it costs a lot of money, or just because they're not cooperative landowners right at the moment, don't dismiss the need.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Well, and the other, just the last thing on this piece, and Ellen, to your point on the master planning, as you're well aware, we'll be doing this all over again in 4 years. So we can continue to update which is the nice part about doing those updates, that as you do your master planning, we can integrate that into the long range plan. And so I think for this update, just getting some of those key connections right, and maybe identifying locations that we need to do further study on, and thinking about how that gets presented in the plan might be the most important.
Sure. I mean, we don't begin to have all the answers. Let's just don't shut the door.
Yep. Perfect.
Okay. Next area.
All right. So this one might be a more simple question, but this relates to what Jennifer was talking about, where we had some, maybe some trade-offs or alternate routes to take, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the River Road connection, because we hear a lot about this. We wanted to look at connections, particularly in the River Road neighborhood. It's one of our Invest Health neighborhoods. There are a lot of equity benefits to these projects. But we started looking at River Road as sort of bisected by Russell Street, and there's sort of maybe two discrete projects that we have, and we focused on making the connection from Russell to Reserve through the River Road neighborhood, and tying that in with connections on a new Johnson Street connection, potentially Curtis Street improvements, but really focusing on that connectivity piece. But there's also the section between Russell and California that I know is, Ellen, you and I have had conversations about the development potential there. The downtown master plan looked at that area as potential. And so this might be another one of those that, the development dictates which one of those happens. But currently we're showing the Russell to Reserve section as being the funded project, but we want to make sure that is, in this context, is that the right choice for what we're showing as recommended, or does it ultimately not matter that much?
Well, if you want me to jump in and make a couple of comments, once again, we're into the spider web. One of the things that we're looking at as an agency, and as Urban Renewal District 2 faces sunset in 10 years, is what do we leave behind when we leave that geographic part of downtown of the city? And one of the things we're talking about is that we have areas, particularly west of Russell, where we have huge utility deficiencies. We have mobile home parks that don't even have fire protection that's adequate. We have lots of houses that are on wells. We have no sewer in places, et cetera. So one of the things that we're talking with, we have a working group that's comprised of some city council and some MRA board members and staff, obviously, in the administration. And one of the things we're talking about is what kind of investment do we make in leaving infrastructure behind so that development can be maximized. And it even goes to power supply. I mean, you've got this whole area west of Russell where you've got these kind of small, almost locally owned industries. A lot of them need three-phase power. They don't have three-phase power, and they don't have the money to run three-phase power. So is that a piece of the infrastructure? Is water a piece of the infrastructure? Not just sidewalks that we leave behind as we exit Urban Renewal District 2. And so if River Road in that area is not some sort of consideration, or there isn't any consideration around how we deal with flooding, and well, it doesn't flood, but floodplain issues because it's mapped, then why would we invest in those utilities? So I think we're, once again, like I said, back in the spider web. And, at some point I'll come down to 5,000 feet, but right now I'm gonna stay at 30. Thousand.
I've got David and Ben with their hands up.
I think Dave's might just be pulled over from his previous comment.
Okay, Ben, did you have something?
I did. It's less about River Road, but I'm glad you're focused on this area. I'm going to put a pitch in for the equity perspective that showing a Johnson Street connection funded, that we don't actually have all of the right-of-way in place, while leaving Curtis, an existing road that existing people are using, unfunded, is, I think, going to be a tough pill to swallow for River Road neighbors that are feeling woefully underserved by their disconnected neighborhood. I'd like to see that switched and see Curtis Street be the one that is funded for complete street improvements, and that we leave Johnson Street on there as a illustrative project if we get that right of way, and if we can make that connection, great. But Curtis is really, it's on our CIP list. It scores pretty well. It's one that we receive regular complaints about, and it's one that I think the neighbors are going to want to see something there sooner there than a street that doesn't exist yet.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Ben. We can definitely, it's that kind of feedback is really helpful, and we can take a closer look at it and try and understand why one was prioritized versus another in terms of scores or other elements that we might have considered. But that is a great example of where we've sort of got two routes that are parallel, but if one is ready to move forward sooner than the other, and if one is more supported by the neighborhood than the other, then let's advance that as our recommended. Great. All right, last one, Aaron. Or sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
Neil has his hand up. Go ahead, Neil.
And I just wanted, thanks, Jeremy and everyone. I just wanted to, the section between, I know that we've all talked about it internally to the city with these development projects that come up occasionally through there, but from California to Russell would be a huge boon to the active transportation network, with all the new improvements with the Russell Street Bridge connecting to, a north-south connection now, and then any future improvements with complete streets or whatever on the River Road from Russell to Reserve. And so even if it's on the illustrative, something again to help us in the future with this development stuff, because it is a constrained right away. And some, as the downtown master plan pointed out, some varying interests of like riparian river health versus transportation, road, pedestrian, and constrained right away. So I think there's going to be a lot going on in there when it develops. So anything could be helpful on that one, I guess.
Okay, great.
While we're still zoomed in this area, I think that Broadway should be shown as committed from Mullen to California, since that's part of phase 2 of the Russell project. And I think that MRA is going to undertake a study of that area as well. So it seems like that is worth at least showing on, if not as committed, at least showing on this map.
Yeah, no, I think that was on my radar too, that's part of the Russell Street project. Sometimes gets lost. It's not a completely, that it's shorter than Mullen to California, but it covers a big chunk of that.
Can we also go back to that River Road connection to the east of Russell? Yeah, I think that should be shown as a non-motorized project rather than a motorized project. I don't think we would ever intend to connect River Road as a motorized street connection under Russell.
Okay, so not a complete streets project, but an active transportation project.
Well, what do others think? I think the focus there would be an active transportation project over anything else.
So Jeremy, this is Shane, but when that project was looked at, one of the options or alternatives that was considered was running that underneath the bridge, and there wasn't enough room between like the bottom of the bridge beams and getting down into the floodplain, and so that just wasn't an option.
I remember the same thing Shane said, and I think part of the reason the bridge elevation goes up so much is just to get over the pedestrian path down there.
Yeah.
And then I think that there's been talk about extending the grid system up through there with Prince and Inez. And so any of those, instead of taking River Road under Russell, it would just be connecting back to the grid system on the east side of the street.
Yeah, I could see us building out local street connections in the area, but from a transportation plan standpoint, I think the critical piece is the non-motorized connection.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, one of the big sticky points that came up during the downtown master plan discussions around this area was how we treat the river. And so the non-motorized connection makes a whole lot more sense in terms of not stirring up a firestorm with Trout Unlimited, Clark Fork Coalition, et cetera, who don't want to see development right up to the river. And if you're running River Road along that area and you're trying to use it somehow as flood control, whether it becomes a levee or whatever, I think we'll be arguing about it for 10 years.
Okay.
So the non-motorized option is a really important option.
On a clarification on that, are we talking like shared use path or neighborhood greenway? I think as soon as we start getting into curb, gutter, sidewalk, like that sort of non-motorized connection, it's basically a complete street, right? I mean, we're replacing that whole street if we're going that route versus putting in neighborhood greenway improvements that are not addressing the whole. Like if we're thinking curb, gutter, sidewalk, bike, dedicated bike facilities, then that in my mind is a complete street project.
I would suggest looking at the downtown master plan in the Wyoming Street area, and what you'll see is a fairly significant greenway through there.
Okay.
Includes non-motorized connections, but does not bring buildings up to the river.
Okay, that's helpful.
Does not bring streets up to the river.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
I mean, maybe this is just a nuance of the way I'm interpreting the colors, but I think that what's shown there now implies that River Road would somehow connect across Russell as a motorized connection. And I think it's not feasible, and it's not in the interest of the river. And so I think showing it as a priority for active transportation rather than motorized, I think helps.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I think it helps us steer in the right direction.
And Jeremy, as you know, this comes up periodically with developers and property owners in that area between Russell and California, and this can help frame the discussions going forward.
That's what I was going to say, is that this is going to be, those improvements, those right-of-way improvements will be development driven, kind of regardless. Maybe the city would come in and do just a non-motorized connection, but if that road is going to get curb, gutter, sidewalk, any sort of those improvements, that's going to be driven by redevelopment, not by a federal aid or a city initiated project necessarily.
No, all the developers just think MRA is going to do it.
So, this is great conversation. We have a couple of slides I really want to make sure we get to before we run out of time and have some discussion. So maybe Jennifer, this is the kind of conversation we want, and we'll have our technical advisory committee meeting. I think, we focused on a couple of city areas here, but there's the same sorts of questions, I think, for county staff on this committee to look at, like the East Missoula to Bonner connections, look at what's in there for Target Range, Orchard Homes, west of Missoula, south of Missoula, and sort of think through these same sorts of questions and conversation that we're having, and hopefully we'll be ready at the technical advisory committee meeting, or send us those comments or reach out and we can walk through it. But I think these are the sorts of things we need to struggle through, I guess, to get this recommended and illustrative project lists where we want them to be.
Yeah, this is great. All right, so we'll skip the next one for now, Erin, and we can talk more about that at technical advisory committee and move on to money.
Yeah, I think I just want to spend a few minutes talking about money. It feels like an important part of the plan, and just give an overview of how we're developing our revenue projections and what funding is going into it, and how we're using that in our recommended scenario. So starting with just sort of an overview of different funding sources, we started with federal revenues. There are a couple of different federal funds that we're looking at. One are the sort of combination of all of the statewide federal funds that are managed and programmed by the Montana Department of Transportation. Those include things like HSIP, TA grants, bridge funds, national highways, interstate maintenance. Not all of those would be even eligible necessarily for new construction projects. Something like interstate maintenance is going into our maintenance program and just making sure that the interstate is well maintained. Those are also programmed, state or district wide, and so there's a role in coordinating with the MPO, but they're not necessarily available for our local priority projects. But we want to show those there and think about what that means for our transportation system and the projects that MDT has on the horizon. Then we have the two primary federal funds that the MPO programs: congestion mitigation and air quality, and surface transportation. We projected those out over the next 30 years. We've used a similar approach that we used in the last plan, which is just assuming a 3% increase every 5 years. It's a really sort of crude method for estimating growth in revenue, but when we're projecting out that far, it gets really hard to estimate what the federal government is going to appropriate for these different programs. So it gives us a way to estimate some growth in revenue, but not get too carried away and assume that we're going to have hundreds of millions of dollars. I will point out and I think we'll have some detail on this on the next slide, but congestion mitigation and air quality, we have sort of an ongoing list of programs and future purchases for things like transit that are part of that Cmak projection. And so we're sort of currently assuming that nearly 45 million of that is currently programmed for things like our TDM programs, supporting transit operations, regional van pool, those sorts of ongoing programmatic expenses. And then surface transportation, that 58 million, that includes the next phase of Russell Street. And so that some of that will get absorbed into Russell as a committed project. And then we have all of our FTA federal transit funding that's going to Mountain Line and some to Mr. TMA for Vanpool. And then a big chunk of what we're showing in our revenue projections are local funds, because I do think it's really important for us to understand how local funding can be used to achieve our local regional priorities. So those include both city and county funds, such as the gas tax, impact fees, the city road district, mill levy going to transit, help with transit operations, and urban renewal funds. And so it's not necessarily meant to commit those projects necessarily, but to show, as federal funding is not keeping up with demand, we're having to use local funds to fill the need for transportation infrastructure. That there's just not, when you look at our discretionary federal funds, it's nowhere near what we have potentially available in local funding. And so I think it's helpful for us to use this long range plan to look at what federal funding can achieve, and then what we have available and how we might prioritize that with local funding. Obviously, there's a city CIP and there's other processes that go toward actually committing those to projects. But I think it's useful for us as a regional entity to think about the role that local funding plays in our transportation system. So looking at our discretionary funding, which is what's going into setting up this recommended scenario, we have a combination of local and federal funds. On the federal side, for the programs that we don't manage, so those statewide programs, we're assuming a certain percentage based on estimates from the last 5 to 10 years. So highway safety improvement did an estimate of how much has been spent in our region over the last 5 years, and then assumed 10% of that would go toward, as a really conservative estimate, 10% would go towards could be used towards safety projects that are part of our local project list. So obviously, you know, again, those safety funds have to go towards, it's based on a statewide evaluation and cost benefit. And so it's hard to say how much of that could be spent, but as a conservative estimate that we would see that much on local projects. Transportation alternatives, we did an estimate, a 5-year estimate of what we've received, which has not been much. And so that's another area where we could potentially get substantially more than this if funding changes or we're more successful in obtaining those. But we're only showing a little over $1 million over 30 years, which is what we would receive if we get the same amount that we received over the last 5 years on average. And then again, discretionary Cmak funds, as I mentioned, about 45 million of that over the next 30 years would be if we maintain our current funding of programs and transit purchases and those other programmatic. Street sweepers is another big part of that. We would have about 3 million available for infrastructure projects. And then surface transportation, we've got about 43 million once we get through Russell Street. So starting in 2029 or 2030, those funds will be available again. And then the remaining are estimates based on using the city's CIP and estimates from the county that are estimates for county, I think probably need some work, but where we're at right now, just trying to get a sense of what might be available for those projects outside of city limits. We use the 5-year CIP to get an annual average. And then after the 5-year CIP time frame, increasing that by 3% every 5 years. So again, using a fairly conservative growth metric for those funding sources. Obviously, gas tax, you know, that could be totally gone within 30 years as we shift in technology, and so we'll have to be thoughtful about that. There's going to have to be a funding source that fills that gap if gas tax starts to, you know, if we shift to electric vehicles and other things that reduce gas tax revenue. And then urban renewal, we just, again, took an estimate of the last 5 years on average, how much has been spent on transportation infrastructure projects and then projected that out. Again, that's going to be dependent on what projects are in urban renewal districts and whether those continue. And so I think that's another area where we're going to have to be intentional about thinking in our recommended project list, what are these local funding sources going towards versus the federal funds. Does that make sense? Are there any questions or thoughts on how we're approaching that? It's very similar to what we used in the last transportation plan, where we looked at federal, state, and local funds, and then tried to, when we got to actually programming and prioritizing projects, we had to look at which projects would be eligible for these different funding sources and make sure we weren't programming urban renewal funds, say, for a project that is outside of an urban renewal district or in an urban renewal district that is going to be out of funds in a short period of time. So does that generally make sense to folks? And I guess the last piece, just thinking about county gas tax, started having some conversations with Shane and getting a sense, but assuming 50% of the revenues would be in the urbanized area, probably not that whole amount would be available for construction projects because there's other maintenance activities. And so that's something we have to, there's still a little bit of teasing out some of these details. We also are not including city road district funds in this yet because a lot of that is wrapped up in the city's sidewalk program. And so one of the ways I think we can address that is just have a project that is similar to what we did in 2016. We have a project that is local street sidewalk construction that is pulling from the road district, and there's an annual amount, and we program that out over 30 years or estimate that out over 30 years. And then whatever's left would be road district that might be eligible for other projects like Eaton Street or, you know, some of the collector and arterial projects. Is that all? And then the maintenance funds from the city gas tax and road district towards maintenance are not currently included in this. I'm still trying to get those estimated, but again, those are programmed to maintenance. So doesn't really affect our recommended project list.
So we just have about 5 more minutes here. Ben, do you have a quick comment?
I do. I was just going to make a pitch to include road district because in our current CIP, we are applying that towards not just some collector complete streets projects, but also some complete streets projects along greenways that are in this recommended list. And so it really will kind of help paint the more complete picture of that. I know that that's subject to change, but so are all of these funding sources. So we might as well include it, is my thought.
Great. Okay, so I'll just wrap us up quickly then. So the other piece that we aren't going to spend much time on today, but just wanted you all to know that this is another key element of what we are developing as we move closer and closer to a draft plan. We talked early on about the fact that to meet the region's ambitious mode share goals and to really be able to move the needle on some of the goals that are set through the plan, it's going to take more than infrastructure. And so we've been developing our thinking around recommended programs and policies as well, which include things like expanding and updating the Transportation Demand Management Program, which could have policy updates included in that as well, really advancing thinking about street typology and design standards, programs like Safe Routes to Transit and Safe Routes for Seniors that build on the Safe Routes to School model. Some work underway to establish principles for emerging mobility. And then another example is really thinking carefully about some of the ideas that have bubbled up around passenger rail and broader interregional connections. There's also, we know, been a good amount of conversation about furthering the connections within the region and thinking about the urban and rural connections as well. So just some quick examples, and we'll certainly talk more about that when we come back next month. And what we have underway right now. So I mentioned when we were talking about the recommended scenario that we'll be meeting with our Citizens Advisory Committee and our Technical Advisory Committee this month, as well as TPCC. And then we are moving toward a final public input point toward the end of February and into the middle part of March. And that will be around the recommended scenario and some of the recommended policies and programs. We'll be asking people for input on that. At the same time, we'll be developing the public review draft of the full plan and anticipate releasing that for a final public review in April as we move toward hopefully adoption of the plan in May. So that's what comes next. And with that, we're happy to answer any final questions and certainly happy to follow up with you all offline as you continue to review things.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. I just want to point out for the committee and for anybody that's watching this that there is a link in the agenda attachments for the interactive map, and it's a very useful map to go and look if you want to look specifically at these projects. Any final questions, comments? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to our last agenda item. We have one old business item, and this is the update on PL fund distribution formulas and potential impacts for the 2020 census.
Yeah, I might, since we only have 2 minutes and I don't want to hold people, and I could maybe talk that fast, but probably wouldn't be useful. And I'm thinking that we can continue to hold this in old business, and we will have in May or June, we are going to have a UPWP presentation as we develop our work plan for the next fiscal year. And I think that will be a really good opportunity to pair those two things. So talk about those two in the same meeting. So we're thinking about our future PL allocations while we're setting our work plan for the next year. And I think that might be a better time. So we just hold this in old business, get everyone out of here on time and come back to it at that time. And we'll just keep it on the agenda.
That sounds fine. Thanks, Aaron. Okay, any announcements or closing comments?
I have one quick announcement just related to I sent some emails out and we've been having some conversations about the proposed census change to metropolitan statistical areas that changes that designation from areas that contain an urbanized area of 50,000 and changing it to urbanized areas of 100,000. And what we've discovered is that it shouldn't affect, we were worried that that would affect our MPO designation potentially, and it looks like it will not. It's changing the MSA designation, but not changing the underlying urbanized area point designation limits of 50,000 that are what MPOs are based on. So felt like a lot of potential hand wringing for nothing, but looks like it shouldn't affect the MPO at this time. So that's my only announcement.
Okay, Dave Gray.
Sorry, I'm muting. Aaron did describe that fairly well. The difference is that we function underneath a federal highways urbanized area, not a census designated urbanized area. We encompass that. And so any of the Federal Register business that people may be seeing is not going to affect us at this point. We're good.
So two different definitions of urban area.
That's right. So there's a census designated urbanized area, and then there's a federal highways urbanized area, and it's a different jurisdictional element that the MPO functions under, and we're good. That's it.
Yeah, I'll just I think I mentioned a little bit about that last time. There's different ways the census data is used, and this highlights a good one. I'll just, I agree with the conclusion that, we're good. Other than, again, with the federal highway reauthorization pending, I mean, that's when you would really start to, want to pay attention to changes along those lines, and
yeah,
I don't want to reinstall fear into anyone's hearts, but eventually it won't be 50,000 people 100 years from now. I mean, eventually some of these things will change, but just keep an eye on the federal reauthorization. Yep.
Well, and thank you for your input on that one, Ryan. And historically, when this kind of change has occurred, then it doesn't necessarily affect existing MPOs. It affects those that may be rising, like Kalispell and Bozeman and that kind of a thing. So if we can keep that clarification clear through you, that would be awesome.
Agree. Yeah, I mean, I think for obvious reasons, and not just the self-interested ones in Missoula's particular case, because you would be on the edge here. I mean, there's typically, a quote unquote grandfathering, or however you want to put it, when we make these types of transitions. Again, for obvious reasons, the federal government's not, shouldn't, if I'm allowed to editorialize a little bit, shouldn't be in the business of putting MPOs out of business. So yeah, hopefully, even if there were changes along these lines, to your point, David, there'd be ways to make that transition smooth for the folks that affect.
We can only hope.
Exactly. I should certainly caveat almost everything I ever say about this. So yes.
As long as people aren't looking at the Federal Register and being concerned unnecessarily, I think that's really what our job is here.
Although kudos for paying attention to the Federal Register.
Yeah, thank you for tracking that. I think it is important to pay attention to those changes that might be coming, so we have an opportunity to provide input at the right time. So we'll keep watching.
Thanks, guys.
I have a quick, while also monitoring changes, there's a new draft of the METCD out that is available for comment that will affect what we can and can't do. I know it gets into the weeds maybe more than we do at this meeting, but all of the TTAC members would, it would behoove us to be paying attention to that and making comments if we can as a community back through the appropriate channels. Maybe I can get Aaron a link that he can send out to TTAC members to monitor that. I believe that comments are still open for a couple months, and I haven't done enough review to know what's on the table, but there will be some changes from the 2009 version that we're all currently following.
Thank you, Ben. No, I appreciate that bit of PR for it too. I mean, and just to give you a little context on this, I mean, the MUTCD is incredibly technical and specific and engineering oriented in many cases. The other thing that's true about the MUTCD is that it's kind of a chronic problem. Yeah, we'll call it a problem on our end about how and to what extent we can practically enforce it, because there's a lot of violations of the MUTCD, and it's not always clear that there's anyone who is in a position to enforce it rigorously. But as more and more examples crop up of violations of the MUTCD that are allowed to persist, there's at least the potential that sometime in the near future, the MUTCD will be more rigorously enforced. And so obviously that would mean that the individual details in there become more relevant to all of us.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, with that, unless there's any other final comments, we will be adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.